In the year 1415, on a field turned to mud by days of rain, a king named Henry V stood with fewer than 6,000 archers, staring across the ground at an army that outnumbered his own by a staggering margin. Within the next few hours, those men would fire something close to 500,000 arrows into the ranks of advancing French soldiers. 500,000! Just say that number slowly and let it sink in. Most people who hear this fact ask the obvious question: where did all those arrows come from? But that is actually the smaller question. The real mystery, the one almost nobody stops to consider, is what kind of massive, invisible system had to exist behind those archers to make that kind of firepower even possible in a world without factories or machines. Because here is the truth that most history lessons skip right over. Those arrows did not simply appear out of nowhere on the battlefield. Every single one of them needed a very specific kind of wood, a very specific kind of iron, a very specific kind of feather, and a very specific kind of string. Each of those materials came from a completely different corner of the world, passed through the hands of different craftsmen, and traveled down different roads before finally meeting inside the same quiver on the same archer's back. Nobody at the time sat down and described it this way, but medieval England had quietly built one of the first true military supply chains in European history. And the entire thing revolved around a single, deceptively simple weapon: the English longbow. So how exactly does a kingdom with no factories, no railways, and no standardized manufacturing manage to produce millions of arrows, tens of thousands of bows, and enough spare bowstrings to arm an entire invading army? That question does not stay in England. It drags you across half of Europe, into goose farms, mountain forests, and blacksmith workshops that almost no textbook ever mentions. And once you start pulling on that thread, you realize the longbow was never really about the bow at all. It was about everything standing behind it. The story actually begins with a strange and almost embarrassing problem. The most famous English weapon in history could barely be built using English trees. A proper warbow, the kind capable of punching through plate armor at 200 yards, needed to be carved from yew wood, and not just any yew would do. The ideal bow stave came from a tree that had grown slowly in cold mountain air, where the grain stayed tight and the wood stayed dense and strong. English yew existed, sure, but it typically grew in milder, softer conditions, which made the grain too loose and the wood too weak for bows that needed to handle draw weights, sometimes exceeding 150 pounds of force. So England had to look elsewhere. And that search turned a simple material shortage into something close to an international trade crisis. The finest yew in Europe grew in the mountains of northern Spain, in the Alps of northern Italy, and scattered through regions of what we now call Germany and Austria. Italian yew, especially from areas near the Po Valley, was treated like gold because it contained the perfect natural combination of heartwood and sapwood, one resisting compression, the other handling tension, forming a kind of built-in laminate that no other timber on earth could replicate. England began importing bow staves by the shipload, and when voluntary trade could not keep up with demand, the government simply forced the issue. In the year 1472, A new law required that for every ton of goods brought into English ports, a certain number of yew bow staves had to be included in the cargo. Wine merchants sailing in from Venice and Genoa were directly targeted by this rule. If you wanted to sell your wine in London, fine, but your ship had better be carrying bow staves as well, whether you liked it or not. That single detail tells you everything about how seriously the Crown treated this supply chain. They were willing to twist international trade agreements and burden their own merchants just to keep the wood flowing steadily into English hands. But sourcing the yew was only the beginning of the challenge. A raw stave arriving at a port was nowhere near a finished weapon. It needed to be seasoned for a year or more, stored carefully to prevent warping, and then handed to skilled craftsmen known as bowyers, who slowly shaped it into something a soldier could actually use in battle. Even the very best bowyers, working steadily, could only produce 2 or 3 quality warbows in an entire week. Now imagine trying to equip 6,000 archers. That means bowyers had to be working for months, sometimes years, before a single campaign even began, just to build up enough weapons. And bows did not last forever. They cracked, they lost their power, they simply broke under repeated use, meaning a long campaign could burn through bows almost as fast as it burned through the arrows being fired from them.
Which brings us to the next layer of this hidden machine. And honestly, this is where the numbers start to feel almost unbelievable. During a real battle, a well-trained English longbowman could fire somewhere between 10 and 12 arrows every single minute. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English archers sustained volleys for so long that the chroniclers writing about it struggled to even describe the sheer volume of arrows filling the sky. At Agincourt, historians estimate that somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 arrows were loose during the fighting, and that number alone should stop you in your tracks. Producing arrows on that kind of scale required an entire specialized workforce that almost never gets mentioned in the history books. The wooden shaft alone needed straight-grained timber, usually ash, birch, or poplar, cut to a precise length of around 28 to 30 inches. Craftsmen known as fletchers ran dedicated workshops where huge bundles of shafts were shaped, sanded down, and carefully sorted by weight and straightness. Because in a mass volley, even a slightly inconsistent arrow could throw off the density and accuracy of the entire attack. Then came the arrowheads, and this is exactly where blacksmiths enter the story. Medieval arrowheads were never one-size-fits-all. A bodkin point was a narrow, square-shaped head built specifically to punch through chainmail and slip through gaps in plate armor, while a broadhead was wider and bladed, designed to cause maximum damage against soldiers with little or no armor at all. Battlefield commanders had to know in advance roughly how much of each type they needed, based purely on intelligence about what the enemy would actually be wearing into the fight. Specialized smiths, sometimes called point makers, worked in tight clusters around major armory towns, and the Tower of London itself served as England's central royal arsenal. Surviving records from the tower show orders for tens of thousands of arrowheads placed months ahead of any planned military campaign. In the year 1341, one single facility recorded an order for over 700,000 arrowheads within a single year, a number so large it almost sounds like a mistake, except it genuinely was not. Every one of those heads had to be forged by hand, hardened, tempered,
and then carefully fitted onto the shaft. And the iron used to make them came from English mines and forges that were also busy supplying horseshoes, sword blanks, and armor rivets for the rest of the army. Iron was never an unlimited resource, so deciding how much of it went specifically toward arrowhead production required constant, deliberate prioritization directly from the crown itself.
Now here comes the part of this story that genuinely surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Every single arrow needed feathers. And not just any feathers. It required flight feathers taken specifically from the wing of a goose. Never a duck, never a chicken, because only goose wing feathers have the rigid, uneven shape that makes an arrow spin properly and fly straight through the air. Each arrow needed exactly 3 feathers, glued carefully along the back of the shaft. And this is where the math gets genuinely staggering. A single goose wing only produces about 2 feathers that are actually good enough for military-grade fletching. That means one finished arrow requires feathers pulled from at least 2 separate geese. Now multiply that by 500,000 arrows fired in a single battle, and you land on a number that sounds almost fictional. A minimum of 1 million geese needed just to supply feathers for one engagement. England responded by maintaining enormous flocks of geese, and certain regions, especially the marshy fenlands of East Anglia and Lincolnshire, grew into major goose farming centers, largely because the military simply demanded it.
Feathers were harvested every year during a specific plucking season, gathered by merchants, and then sold in bulk directly to fletchers preparing for war. When conflict was close, the crown sometimes bypassed normal trade entirely and simply requisitioned feathers on the spot. It was not only about gathering enough of them either. Fletchers were extremely particular about which wing each feather came from, because mixing left wing and right wing feathers on the same arrow would cause the natural curve to fight against itself, sending the arrow spinning wildly off course during flight.
Every batch of arrows had to stay uniform. Left wing feathers grouped together, right wing feathers grouped separately, and never combined under any circumstances. Now imagine trying to sort that correctly across thousands of bundles collected from hundreds of scattered farms all across the countryside. That sorting process alone was a massive logistical headache that required careful coordination long before a single feather ever touched a finished arrow.
But even a perfect arrow with a perfect head and perfect feathers was useless without a working bow, and every bow needed a proper string. A longbow string was usually twisted from linen or hemp cord, waxed carefully to hold its shape under enormous pressure. Strings regularly snapped under the strain of a bow drawing well over 100 pounds of force, and a broken string in the middle of battle instantly turned a skilled archer into a helpless bystander until he could restring his weapon.
Because of this, every single archer carried at least one spare string, sometimes 2, kept dry and coiled beneath his hat or tucked safely inside a waxed pouch. Hemp mostly came from domestic farms across England, while higher quality linen cords were occasionally imported from the Low Countries in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. String makers who supplied the military worked completely separately from those who served ordinary civilian needs, because military strings had to meet exact standards for twist count and thickness that left absolutely no room for error. If a string was too thin, it snapped almost immediately. If it was too thick,
It slowed the arrow down and reduced both range and penetration on the battlefield. Coating the finished string in beeswax made it water-resistant, which mattered enormously during the long, rain-soaked campaigns English armies frequently fought through across the French countryside. And once every component was finally finished, the arrows, the bows, and the strings, all of it still had to physically travel to exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which introduced yet another entire layer of complexity to this hidden machine. Arrows were bundled into groups of 24 and packed tightly into barrels for transport along rough, rutted medieval roads. Bows were carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and shipped in bulk from port towns toward staging areas near the coast, ready to be loaded onto ships. Spare strings were counted, waxed, bundled, and distributed to individual units before the army ever set sail. Behind every marching medieval army sat a long train of wagons dedicated purely to archery supplies, sometimes dozens of carts carrying nothing except arrows and replacement bows. And losing even a handful of those carts to a sudden cavalry raid could cripple an army's ability to fight almost overnight. Consider what Edward III's invasion force needed just to prepare for the Crecy campaign in 1346. Ships had to be gathered from across the country, supplies loaded carefully, horses transported safely, and thousands of barrels of arrows stacked deep inside the cargo holds below deck. Once the army finally landed in Normandy, every single one of those supplies then had to move overland alongside marching soldiers, protected from ambush, shielded from constant rain, and rationed with extreme care, because any resupply sailing back from England could take weeks to arrive. The English crown understood exactly how fragile this entire system was, which is precisely why it was reinforced with strict laws from the very top. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 required every man of fighting age to personally own weapons matching his social class. And for the common man, that almost always meant owning a bow, along with a proper supply of arrows. Later laws pushed this even further, with Edward III eventually banning football and other Sunday games entirely, forcing men to spend that time practicing archery instead. Because this was never about leisure. It was a deliberate, nationwide military training program enforced directly by local sheriffs and magistrates. The logic behind it was brutally simple, but remarkably effective. If every village across England already contained men who knew how to shoot, the crown never had to waste time training soldiers completely from scratch the moment war broke out. It only had to keep them properly supplied. And keeping them supplied was already an enormous challenge on its own. Royal officials, known as keepers of the king's arrows, managed production and stockpiling, while commissions of array, essentially medieval draft orders, told each county exactly how many archers it had to send, often specifying the precise number of arrows every single man was required to bring with him. Think about what that actually meant in real terms. If one county received a commission for 500 archers, each carrying 48 arrows, that single county needed to produce 24,000 arrows just for the very first wave of supply. If the campaign dragged on for months, resupply shipments then had to follow the army continuously, which meant an unbroken production pipeline running back home in England, constantly feeding forward into the war zone overseas. This was, in every practical sense, A medieval kingdom running a just-in-time manufacturing and logistics operation centuries before anyone had ever coined that phrase.
This entire system also rippled outward into English society in ways nobody fully planned for. You importing quietly enriched certain merchant families and port towns along the coast. Goose farming regions gained an economic importance that stretched far beyond simple agriculture. Blacksmiths in armory towns enjoyed guaranteed government contracts that kept their forges running even during peacetime, while bowyers held a protected, regulated trade not unlike a modern defense contractor working closely with the state. And every English village built communal shooting ranges, known as butts, which slowly became social gathering spots as much as military training grounds. But this extraordinary system carried the seeds of its own destruction from the very beginning. The demand for yew never slowed down, and yew trees grow painfully slowly, often needing 60 to 100 years before a single tree becomes suitable for cutting bow staves. Across the 14th and 15th centuries, England, Spain, Italy, and the German states collectively stripped their yew forests at a pace the land simply could not sustain. By the late 1400s, complaints about yew shortages began appearing in official government records across the entire continent, and Venice, once a major hub for the yew trade, started restricting exports as its own supplies began running thin. At the exact same time, the human side of this supply chain was quietly falling apart too. Training a genuinely competent longbowman took years of dedicated practice, not weeks and not months. A boy typically had to start shooting in childhood, and the physical strain required to draw a bow with a 140-pound pole left permanent, visible changes in the human skeleton, changes that archaeologists can still identify centuries later in medieval remains, including enlarged left arms and thickened shoulder bones. These were men whose very bodies had been physically reshaped by years spent mastering a single weapon. Compare that grueling process to a crossbow, which an ordinary soldier could learn to use competently within a matter of weeks. Or early firearms, which required even less training than that. The longbow remained the superior weapon in terms of rate of fire and effective range against most targets on the battlefield. But crossbows and early guns offered something the longbow simply could not: a supply chain and training pipeline that was dramatically shorter and far cheaper to maintain. Historians still argue over whether the longbow eventually died from the top down or the bottom up, but either way, the pipeline of properly trained longbowmen had already begun drying up by the late 1500s.
And once that pipeline finally closed, there was no realistic way to reopen it. The longbow did not vanish because some obviously better weapon instantly replaced it overnight. It disappeared because the massive, invisible system supporting it could no longer sustain its own weight. The yew supply was running dry. Trained archers were aging without enough replacements coming up behind them, and the cost of maintaining the entire infrastructure kept climbing at the exact moment cheaper alternatives became widely available. By the time of the English Civil War in the 1640s, a handful of remaining skilled longbowmen could still technically outshoot a musketeer in raw speed, but there were almost none of them left, and rebuilding that entire chain from scratch was simply no longer worth attempting. What makes this story genuinely remarkable is not just the weapon itself,
Because plenty of videos will tell you about draw weights and armor penetration and famous battles. What almost nobody ever talks about is the invisible machine standing quietly behind it. The trade routes, the laws, the goose farms, the yew forests, the blacksmith contracts, the string makers, the transport carts, and the county quotas working together in near silence. That hidden machine is exactly what allowed the English longbow to dominate European battlefields for nearly 2 centuries straight. And when that machine finally collapsed under its own weight, the legendary weapon it once supported collapsed right along with it, proving that even the most iconic tools in history are only ever as strong as the invisible systems quietly holding them up.